Merci beaucoup. Pardon, je ne peux pas parler en français, mais en anglais. I thank you very much for having me here. It's truly an honor to be here present on the panel and to think about emancipation, but also what does it mean to live emancipation. So, of course, you know that with the resistance of the heroic city of Kobane, which became the bastion of resistance against the so-called Islamic State, where a forgotten community basically gained a historic victory against the fascism of Islamic State or Daesh, whose ideology is, of course, based on destroying all cultures, all communities, all languages, and especially women in the Middle East, all the colors of the Middle East, by painting it black like its own flag. This restored faith in humanity across the world. So this resistance was not only a victory against the most overtly fascist group of our time, but it was also a wake-up call for anti-system movements around the world, leftist, anarchist, feminist movements around the world, to find out what does it mean to live radical democracy, emancipation in practice. And with the emergence of Rojava, the northern parts of Syria, they saw theory and practice unify, and they saw this most aesthetically manifested in the smiles of Kurdish women whose history has never been written, and now they were fighting against those who want to erase history. So, of course, like many stateless people, the Kurds have suffered the consequences of statelessness heavily, from discrimination on an everyday basis, to genocide, to massacre, to denial, to the most brutal genocides. But the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, like many other national liberation movements, initially thought that the creation of a united Kurdish state would be the solution to their problems. However, with the changing world and also with the fundamental self-critique, as well as the criticism of the socialist practices at that time, which were very much focused on fixating on the state or seizing hierarchical power, towards the end of the 1990s, the leadership of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, who has been jailed on Imralı Island for the last 17 years, soon it will be the 17th anniversary of his capture, he traces the roots of oppression actually to the emergence of the state, and the state actually emerged in Mesopotamia. So by referring to communal life organizations in the Neolithic age, or before the transition to the statist civilization, in ancient Sumer, Öcalan believes that the state is actually the original sin of humanity, and argues that real socialists and national liberation movements failed to achieve emancipation because of their preoccupation with statehood rather than the deepening of democracy. So, because the state and democracy are not compatible with each other. At the Newroz celebrations, Newroz is the new year celebrated across Mesopotamia. Of 2005, the new paradigm called democratic confederalism was declared. So what is democratic confederalism? Based on gender equality, ecology, and grassroots democracy, also radical democracy in other words, the new project of democratic confederalism is an attempt to give power back to the people and govern locally instead of relying on the state. So the decisions are taken in local communes and people's councils, and the will of the people, in a way, is delegated. So it's coordinated, actually. It's not delegated or submitted. The will of the population is not submitted to another institution, but it's coordinated through committees, which merely serve to implement these collective decisions. So democratic confederalism is a model of social, political, economic, also cultural administration, based on the self-administration of the different peoples in Kurdistan, but also beyond, pioneered by the women and the youth, who play a very important key role in achieving this democracy. And the Kurdish freedom movement is proposing this as an alternative to the world, and actually it's an alternative to the state. So it's not statelessness, but the state that is the problem, an obstacle to freedom. So in order to subvert the domination of the system that has institutionalized itself globally, across the globe, as a synthesis of patriarchy, capitalism, and the state, and specifically the ideologically, more specific nation state over the span of 5,000 years, this system is based on the opposite. So instead of patriarchy, you have women's liberation, gender equality; instead of capitalism, ecology; and instead of state, grassroots, radical democracy. So as an act of defiance against the state system. This new idea is based on democratic autonomy. So the overarching system is democratic confederalism, but it's built through democratic autonomy. And this means that the people organize themselves most basically and importantly in the form of communes. So the communes are the most important unit of the system. And this is based on a so-called ethical political society, which understands the involvement in resolving social issues and taking care of everyday self-governance as a common responsibility. So me being political, me taking decisions together with my neighbors, with my friends, with the people I live with, this is my responsibility. It's not just me voting once a year. So rather than submitting my will to the bureaucratic elites, I am responsible for my life. So committees and communes, they take care of everyday issues by creating a conscious society. Because without a conscious, educated society that knows what is happening around them, you cannot expect real transformation, real change. So people's councils from the neighborhood to the village to the town to the regional levels are political spheres in which politics is basically coming alive in the hands of the people. I will give some examples later on. But only when they cannot be solved at the base, they are delegated to the next institution. So throughout the system, there is the principle of co-presidency, which means that there's one woman and one man governing together, either party leadership or neighborhood, commune, etc. The idea is to split power between one woman and one man. And it has both symbolic as well as practical reasons, because it means to decentralize power, to encourage compromise, and to promote consensus finding. It's also symbolizing the lost harmony between men and women. So only women have the right to elect the female co-chair of a party, of a commune, and etc., in order to make sure this is a completely women's autonomous decision. And women in general play a pioneering role in the building of democratic autonomy. And they have their own more ideological and autonomous structures within this. So in 2009, in Turkey, the Democratic Autonomy Project was declared, and like all kinds of local self-governance structures like village councils, cooperatives, schools, autonomous youth and women's organizations were formed. But so like farming cooperatives, etc. But under the so-called KCK operations, thousands of people, in fact 10,000 people, were put in prison under the separatism or terrorism law in Turkey. So right now there's 10,000 political prisoners in Turkey, and most of them are teachers, writers, activists, and so on, lawyers, mayors. So in short, we can say that democratic confederalism is an attempt to reclaim and transform power and construct a way of practically expressing the people's will. It's an expression of the people's will. And this can only happen if the society is actually politicized and conscious to do that. And this, of course, requires education. So it's a democracy without a state. And although, are you okay? No? It's before women. Yeah, it's after this.
Okay. Turkey, yes.
Yeah. This is what I was saying. So it's a democracy without a state. And although this seems to be very far away from our emancipation today, this model, actually we see in Rojava that this resonates with the people. People feel like this comes very organic. This kind of self-governance, radical democracy model. Actually, the nation-state system is very new, especially for the Middle East. It's a very new thing. So communal life organizations actually make sense to the people once they're implemented. So of course, when it comes to women, and I'm sure many of you know by now that the Kurdish women's movement is actually a very strongly organized force that is currently not just fighting against Daesh, but also against all forms of fascism. Women are often active in national liberation struggles or in general revolutionary struggles, but once liberation is perceived to be achieved, they usually experience a backlash in their new gained status. So because of the fact that women's issues are often treated as side issues, not as the main issue, not as the main contradiction, but as a side issue, they get lost afterwards. So especially in the Middle East, right now we can say it's not just enough for women to say, we want peace, we condemn violence. No, women need an active form of self-defense, especially right now in the Middle East. So in that sense, the fact that the Islamic State has risen and massacred especially the Yazidi population and enslaved and gang raped and sold women as sex slaves, this has shown that women cannot rely on men or state armies to defend themselves. And actually, Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, he articulates that women are the first historical colony and believes that not just the state is the problem, but actually masculinity, patriarchy is at the core of the problem. I want to give a quote. He says, "Man is a system. The male has become a state and turned this into the dominant culture. Class and sexual oppression develop together. Masculinity has generated ruling gender, ruling class, and ruling state. When man is analyzed in this context, it is clear that masculinity must be killed. Indeed, to kill the dominant man is the fundamental principle of socialism. This is what killing power means, to kill the one-sided domination, the inequality and intolerance. Moreover, it is to kill fascism, dictatorship, and despotism." And please don't forget, this is a male leader of a Middle Eastern national liberation movement. So this is very important to keep in mind. So today, the Kurdish freedom movement has the principle of co-chairs everywhere from the Kandil Mountains to Diyarbakir to Kamışlı, and also here in Brussels, there's the system of co-presidency. The Rojava system, which I will elaborate on, has this principle from the canton level to the neighborhood council. So apart from co-chairs and quotas, the Rojava cantons, we can see there's 3 cantons in Rojava that were declared exactly 2 years ago. They have women's self-defense units, women's communes, academies, tribunals, and cooperatives. And in the midst of war, this is what they're doing. And under the weight of an economic and political embargo. So the women's movement, Yekta Stat, is autonomously organized in all walks of life, and from the defense to education to economy to health. And autonomous women's councils, they exist parallel to the People's Council. So there's a People's Council, and there's also an autonomous women's council in the same level. And the women's councils can veto the decisions of the other. So men who commit violence against women, they're not supposed to be part of the administration. And women are now primary decision makers, judges, policy makers, especially on issues concerning violence against women, and gender-based discrimination, forced marriage, honor killings, child marriage, etc. are banned. And many non-Kurdish women, especially Arabs and Syriac Christian women, they've joined the ranks, the armed ranks, as well as the administration in Rojava. So it's interesting to see that the women's liberation has always been part of the PKK's project, but with the rise of the critique of the state, women's autonomy in the PKK developed as well. This is very important to keep in mind. The more hierarchies were criticized, the more women became an autonomous force inside this freedom movement. So in that sense, we can say women's liberation for struggles to think about emancipation, it must not just be an aim after the revolution, it has to be a method here and now. It has to be built right now. We cannot compromise it to after, because otherwise it will not be a revolution. And there is a large banner in Kamışlı, it's in Rojava, that says, "We will defeat the attacks of Daesh by guaranteeing the freedom of the women in the Middle East. Only this way, only through the strength of women, we can defeat the mentality of Daesh." How much time do we have? Okay. So another very fundamental idea of democratic confederalism is democratic nation. And of course, when we think about democratic nation, we think about a nation that is democratic, but that's not the idea. Öcalan articulates this as dissociating the nation from ethnic implications, but instead building it on ethical implications. So on values, on principles, on morals. So in other words, it's a unity of thought, and everyone can be part of this nation. Arabs, Turks, Kurds, everyone can be part of this nation. It's no longer like an ethnic nation, but an ethical nation. So, and it has to consist of political subjects rather than objects of the state, which is right now what citizenship looks like. So it's, so in that sense, against this racist premises of the separatist nation-state order and its mental as well as physical borders, we need a democratic nation where ethnic, religious, cultural, linguistic identities can express themselves, and actually the more they exist, they add shades to this diversity. The more diverse this democratic nation is, the more democratic it will be. So, and the fact that this is happening where the Kurds predominantly live, and they're attacked by Daesh, by Turkey, by everyone, and they say this is actually our project, and actually this isn't on the translation, but maybe we can say that later. Right now the Geneva 3 conference will take place to solve the Syrian problem, but this idea is not invited, but radical Islamist groups are invited. So we can see the world does not want this kind of system to succeed. So in that sense, this kind of idea of democratic nation is against the one nation, one flag, one religion idea that is now currently dominating the Middle East, which has also been imported by Europe to some degree. So in that sense, in Rojava right now, we can see that the Kurds, Arabs, Syriacs, Armenians, Turkmen, the Chechens form to live a new creative alternative life together. And in the Jizre canton, for example, the co-presidents are one Arab tribal leader and a former Kurdish woman guerrilla fighter. So you have these two people, one Arab tribal leader and a Kurdish female guerrilla fighter, who now govern together. And this is the revolution itself in the Middle East. So 3 official languages were declared: Kurdish, Arabic, and Syriac. So maybe in Europe this is kind of normal, but this isn't normal at all in the Middle East, right? Especially not in the situation of war. So they risk inefficiency in a way to make sure that it's not just Kurds, but all ethnic and religious identities that can express themselves. And they have a social contract that was adopted in January 2014, I think. And it starts like this: we, the people of the democratic autonomous regions of Afrin, Jizire, and Kobani, a confederation of Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Armenians, Turkmen, Armenians, and Chechens, freely and solemnly declare and establish this charter, which has been drafted according to the principles of democratic autonomy. So we see this isn't a law, a constitution, which is enforced by coercion and law and enforcement. No, it's a social contract. It is based on voluntary participation. But of course, getting this kind of consciousness requires a lot of education. So, of course, this kind of system needs to be defended. And how can self-defense be a philosophical thing as well, not just like a physical self-defense? How can we think differently about self-defense? So in the Kurdish freedom movement, the concept of self-defense lies on the idea of legitimate self-defense, and includes not just a physical self-defense, but also establishing social and political mechanisms that will protect society against not just physical self-defense. So Öcalan says that in nature, living organisms such as roses, have their thorns, and they are there because they have to protect themselves. So every living being has a mechanism of self-defense. So in that sense, if we look at that, if we look at nature's forms of self-defense rather than copying militaristic ideas of defense, we can protect the kind of society we want. He calls this the rose theory. And so in that sense, we must refrain from state-like concepts of force and instead promote communalist values that derive its power from the grassroots. So this, of course, is based on a society that is politicized, self-aware, conscious, and active. And we have to have community lobbying ethics if we want this kind of self-defense idea. So it has to be, based on fundamental values such as the commitment to women's liberation, rather than, as I've said, relying on the police or law to enforce it. So of course, this is really hard to get. But in Rojava, how this functions is that without hierarchy, control, and domination, of course, there is military discipline. But in the midst of war, there's an incredible amount of ideological education among the fighters who fight against Daesh. So, which is of course a very traumatizing war, but half of their education is on gender equality, for example. The academies, they educate their fighters to say, we're not a force of revenge, and we have to be militarized right now because we're in a war situation, because you cannot be pacifist if you're being attacked by Daesh. So the academies are like that too, and they want to have a society without armed forces, actually, ultimately, like ideally. Of course, this is hard to implement at the moment, but they want to have a society where you will not need security forces to solve problems, but an educated society that is able to solve its own problems, because that's eventually what emancipation and everything comes down to, a society that is able to solve its own problems, its own issues too. So in that sense, again, as I've said, this is based on building an ethical, political society. And so we must tackle also all kinds of philosophical attacks on society, because we look at the current education system, everything is about denouncing community, society. The state is needed because otherwise people will kill each other. So we need the state, we need the police, we need the law, and so on. This is the kind of education system, this is the kind of the system in which we live in. And this, the idea in Rojava is to say, actually no, we must also defend ourselves against ideological, mental attacks against society. So that's why we need education, to politicize the entire society, empower people's consciousness, and collectively transform this. So the PKK also has a very profound criticism of positivist science. It has very interesting ideas about the relationship between knowledge and power, also benefiting from thinkers like Foucault. And because right now the status quo sociology especially is almost reinforcing oppression. So yes, so we need a new kind of realization of sociology that needs to be expressed and centered around the voices of the oppressed, especially around women. So there's also within the Kurdish freedom movement a new women's paradigm to science. So one example would be in Rojava, there's a social sciences academy where there's a 70-year-old woman who recites traditional folk tales and as a class. So the students go there and listen to the 70-year-old woman, and this is of course a radical act of defiance against the monist regime, which says this is what it is, this is what it was, and she recovers knowledge, because the Kurdish freedom movement says that knowledge is actually everywhere. Every one of us possesses knowledge, and all kinds of knowledge is valuable. So we need to, when we think about emancipation, we also need to think about how the social sciences right now work, because they are huge obstacles to our freedom. In North Kurdistan, Turkey, right now we see a huge war being escalated by the Turkish army and the state, and most people actually see the guerrilla as their life guarantee, but they've also developed a political strength based on their self-governance, their own democratic autonomy. So right now, it's the people who build the barricade. It's the people who defend themselves against no longer the guerrillas. It's now the people who are doing this. And in cities and villages like Silopi, Cizre, Nusaybin, and so on, where people have built their communes and self-governance structures, we see how this is functioning and how aggressively the state is going against it. So the last things I want to say is about the idea of radical democracy in general, because I think we will also have a talk about the Zapatistas, and I haven't been here in the conference, unfortunately. I can't understand because it's French, but we need to really demystify it. We shouldn't think about radical democracy as this very abstract and theoretical thing. I think this is a very wrong methodology when we really want to radicalize democracy. It has actually, really fundamentally, it has to do with love for the community. And I actually had photos with me about Rojava, but unfortunately we can't show them right now. The communes, they're just people, women, with all of their children. They decide together, they discuss, they argue. This is the kind of radical democracy that we should think about. Democracy cannot be radical if it's just people sitting in very isolated circles and theorize about it. We have to think about practical steps. We have to think about how can a homeless person outside, outside of this conference, for example, what will they get from theoretical ideas about radical democracy if this will not change their life? So these are very important questions that we need to ask. So in Rojava, for example, unlike in advanced capitalist settings, the idea of community is not dead, And I think this is what it comes down to, the idea of community. What does it mean? I organized actually the first academic delegation to Rojava with people like David Graeber, Janet Beale, and other people. And we were there, doing interviews and stuff. And I was really asking myself, how many of us can live in this kind of system? How many of us can actually live in this radical democracy? Can we actually accept it that, maybe a woman with no education, she will now be a judge. maybe she has 10 kids, she cannot read and write, but now she's in charge of justice. Can we accept that? You know, these are questions that people need to ask when they really, really mean it when they say radical democracy. Can we actually give up the anonymity of the state? Right now we all live in states and there's this enormous bureaucracy and it's protecting our anonymity. Can we actually give that up and actually really engage with the people to make meaningful decisions? Will we dedicate and almost maybe risk our lives for a different society? This is what radical democracy should be about. Can we trust a woman like that to become a decision maker? Or do we just talk about radical democracy for each other? So in that sense, I think that's the last thing I want to say. When we look at Rojava, it looks really, you know, on one hand you have these smiling women whose history has never been written, fight against the Islamic State, the most brutal, the most fascist, the most patriarchal force of our time. It's just extremely brutal. So you look at it and it looks like a movie, it looks like a novel. But actually, it's not a coincidence at all. It's not a coincidence that it's those people who have been marginalized from dominant history writing, that it's them who have the heart to fight against the most destructive force of our time. So in that sense, this in Mesopotamia, this is where the state began to emerge. This is where patriarchy began to institutionalize itself. This is where the idea of private property began to take fruit. This is where the women first lost their status in society. And now we can say, actually, this is the really civilizational battle. The civilizational battle right now is not, you know, the West against Islam or East against West or something like that. No, actually we see now a different form of clash of civilizations, of the statist, mainstream dominant civilization, which, you know, includes the capitalist system just like it does Daesh. And on the other hand, we have marginalized, oppressed people and women fighting against this kind of system. So what connects things like the first uprisings of women in history to the Paris Commune, to the rise of the Islamic State and the fight in Kobani is this kind of red line of history. We can say there have always been hierarchies, but there's also always been struggles against that. So in that sense, I just want to say that Rojava is not the answer to everything. We cannot just implement the exact same copy thing here, but it is definitely, it is a revolution of life. It is a manifesto of life, and I think it should be the task of people, especially here in Europe, to analyze it well, to see that this is actually an attempt to dare imagining another world. It is truly a revolution of the people, and I really want to encourage you all to be in solidarity with Rojava, but also with North Kurdistan at the moment, which is under siege of the Turkish army. We must understand Europe is now serving the Islamic State through its policy with Turkey especially, and this is of course a different question, but actually it's not. The way we look at democracy right now, it determines life. That's why these discussions are really, really important. So thank you very much for your attention.